This is URN.
Hello and welcome to The Big Picture. We are back after the Christmas break. Apologies for no theme tune. Unfortunately, Zeta, which is the software that URN uses to have music, got wiped over the Christmas holidays and I didn't put the theme tune back in. My mistake. Apologies. So here we are, cold opening. Well, this is The Big Picture. We are live on University Radio Nottingham. I am still Felix Hawes. And joining me today we have Ted.
Hello.
Hello, Ted. And Ben.
Hello, Felix.
Hello, thank you both for coming on. It is the exam season for many students, so very grateful for Ted and Ben coming on today. So today we will be talking about Section 35 being issued by the UK government in response to the gender reform bill that was put forward and passed in Holyrood. That's the Scottish devolved Parliament. We will also be talking about the bonfire of EU laws that is to come. That is a legacy of Liz Truss's very short-lived government that is still to come, and we will also be talking about the many strikes that the UK is facing. But first of all, then, let's address Section 35 that has been issued by the UK government. So this is a piece of legislation that the government can use, and it's the first time that Westminster has used this against any of the devolved assemblies, which basically means they can overrule, in this case, Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament, and block a bill from getting royal assent, which is what makes a bill become law. So the gender reform bill was passed by Holyrood. The SNP government put it forward. It was supported by most SNP members of the Scottish Parliament, not all, but most. The Greens, Labour and the Lib Dems opposed by the Conservatives. It passed in December, I believe, and this bill would allow anyone to it lowers the age you have to be in a gender from 2 years to 3 months, and also from 18 to 16. The UK government has said that this contradicts or undermines the UK Equalities Act, and therefore they have blocked it. So I suppose you've got two fronts here of both the issue of what the bill was about, but also the issue of devolved decision making, and the fact this is the first time the sort of nuclear option has been used. To our panel, what do you think the consequences of this will have on the union, if any? What do you think, Ben? Should we start with you?
So I think you're right to divide it into its implications for devolution and its impact for the actual issue itself. On the question of lowering the age in which you can register your own gender from 18 to 16, I think the government, its actions, well, I think they're evil, really. I think it's really an attempt by the government to refocus the matter of debate on cultural issues, on issues of immigration, and in this case on issues of transgenderism, those who wish to change their gender, because they think they can win the election by roping together basic prejudices within the British public and try and cruise to victory. And that's what they're doing. They are trying to exploit some of the most vulnerable people in our society, some people most open to harassment in our society, and hoping it will score them a win. So on that front, I'm afraid I just think it's evil. And on the implications for devolution, it's really quite reckless as well. This is a government that allegedly cares about the union, allegedly wants to see the union continue, but the Sewell Convention, when we brought in devolved government, makes it very clear that you're not to interfere with Scotland if they are not implementing laws that affect the wider United Kingdom, which this isn't. And this is a total breach of that. So we're on both fronts. I think it's really quite reckless and a desperate attempt to try and regain popularity with the public, which won't succeed, in my view.
Ted, do you agree with Ben on the motive behind Rishi Sunak and his government, in Alistair Jack, and as the Scottish Secretary, was the one that did implement the Section 35 on Sunak's orders, I'm sure. Do you believe that the motives are correct, that it's a sort of attempt to get the cultural conservatives to realign themselves with the party, as it stands, the Conservatives are 20 points behind in the polls. What do you think, Ted?
No, I don't think that its motives are evil, as Ben put it. I'm not entirely sure, I'll admit. But I think there is just genuine legal grounds that I think it does have implications for the rest of the United Kingdom. And equality law is not a devolved matter. I don't see how you can have a situation where somebody is crossing the border and suddenly their certificates has their sex different than what it is in Scotland. I think that's madness. But we'll see. It'll end up in courts, I'm sure, and the courts will determine whether it was a correct use of the Section 35. There is that separate matter that I really do hope that the British government haven't done this on ideological lines. They should only exercise Section 35 if they believe that it is at odds with British legislation. And at the moment, I agree. We'll see. It's not clear cut, I'll admit. But I think the best way for it is for it to go through the courts. And I don't think it's a electoral strategy, because the polling that I've seen this week suggests that the Tories are being urged desperately not to try and start a culture war. The British public do not want to see in the next election the Tory party just ignites a culture war. People have got far more important things that they want the government to be doing, and starting culture wars is not one of them, it appears, according to the polling.
Culture wars is an interesting one, isn't it? And it's the Conservatives do believe they will win on that, I think, which is what Ben was saying. And looking at polling, the gender reform bill was deeply unpopular, but then again, it isn't a concern, as you say, for most people. With the undermining of UK legislation, Lord Falconer, Charlie Falconer, who was the former Justice Secretary under Gordon Brown, Lord Chancellor before that, he has said that he does not believe, upon looking at the gender reform bill and the reasons for Section 35 issued by the government, that it does undermine the Equalities Act. He points out that as it stands in UK law anyway, that if, this is one of the reasons that's been highlighted in the debate, that if you could not refuse someone who, in a same-sex space, as it stands in UK law, if they claim to be the gender that they are, which this is links to comments that have been made or concerns that have been made by some that this law could be exploited by predators, male predators that claim to be women. And Lord Falconer says, although he makes the point that this is an issue that is very small as it stands, and also makes the point that if it is an issue, is something that exists already under UK law and isn't affected by this particular law. So it will be interesting to see what the courts say to this. Ben, what do you make to Labour's stance? So the Scottish Labour Party supported this bill, and I think all but two of its MSPs backed it. But Keir Starmer's position seems to be, we sort of don't really see how this breaks the Equalities Act, but we're going to wait until we see what the government's lawyers have said. It's sort of a bit on the fence response. Do you think that's a fair comment by me saying that, or what do you think to Labour's response to this?
Yes, I think your comment is exactly right. It's a classic piece of Keir Starmer fudge. Keir Starmer is... The basic calculation in his head is that the overwhelming majority of the Labour Party membership supports this bill. I believe the majority of the Scottish voters support this bill, but he is concerned that a large number of Labour voters, so less left-wing, and many of them particularly, so the stereotype goes in the red wall, more socially conservative than Labour members, he's worried that they will support the bill and won't like Labour going against it. So he's, as with most other issues, is trying to fudge the issue and hope he can concentrate on the cost of living issues, which he believes are more important, which in the grand scheme of what the public considers are. On Ted's point about leaving it to the courts, well, the courts will uphold the decision because legally the UK, the Westminster Parliament, can override any decision of the Scottish Parliament at any time, because we are a parliamentary democracy and the Parliament in Westminster has ultimate control. So the question of whether it's legal or not, it is, there's no doubt there, but on whether it's morally right is an entirely different question, and on whether it's a sensible decision is an entirely different question again. The UK Parliament can override any piece of legislation in the Scottish Parliament that it wants to, but it cannot do so and claim to have moral legitimacy or to claim to be acting in the best interests of the Union.
Do you think that... So, according to polls, the majority of the Scottish population, I think it's something like 60 to 70% from memory, don't support the legislation that the Sturgeon administration has put forward. But also, of course, most Scottish people, even amongst the Unionists, support devolution quite strongly. Do you think that this will affect the position on the Union for those that are perhaps more on the fence? Bearing in mind, poll came out recently. I can't remember, I'm afraid, which polling company did it, but there didn't seem to be much change in the independence. It was like a point difference, actually in favour of no to independence, that's come out since this. So, but do you think in the long term, when this sort of battle in the courts does kick off, that this might affect people, even those that actually think, such as Joanna Cherry, a SNP MP who opposes the gender reform bill? She's a MP in Westminster. She, although opposes that bill, believes that that is a decision that should be made by the Scottish Parliament and should not be blocked. Do you think there would be a lot of... I know this is a long-winded question, sorry. Do you think there'll be a lot of Scottish people that share that view, that they might not like the bill, but they do believe that it is the right of Holyrood to pass this? What do you think, Ted?
I don't think it'll have a major impact on people's belief in the Union, primarily because I don't think that people have that much nuance in their own thoughts. There won't be people, or many people, that are the cultural conservatives that don't like this bill but will have any really strong feelings about Westminster overriding the Scottish government. If it was I only see a situation in which people that believed in this bill anyway seriously annoyed by the British government stepping in. There'll be some people that will be able to deal with the nuance a bit more and perhaps be pushed more towards wanting to leave the Union, but I can't see, based on this one piece of legislation, many votes shifting.
Do you agree with that, Ben?
I think the next election and its result in Scotland will be affected by this legislation, but not in the sense of what do you think of the bill by itself. It'll be to what extent this is paraded around by the Conservatives as we've put down those rowdy SNP people once again. And if it does that, and if the Mail and the Telegraph parade it as such, then I think it will drive a lot of SNP voters or swing voters who maybe don't like the bill but are sick of Conservatives down south taking the mick out of them, really. It could have a very significant impact in them once again voting to signal their intent to leave the Union, or certainly to depart from the current government. So I think it could have a significant impact, just not potentially on the merits of the actual piece of legislation, but on the wider politics of it.
Interesting. So I'm going to go back to Labour. It's highly likely, looking at the opinion polls, although we can't say for certain, but it does appear that Labour are to probably be the next party in power within, a year or two. When this happens, if it happens, I should say, what is going to happen regarding this bill? The SNP will still be in office in Scotland. Now, this is obviously a hypothetical question. We don't know. Keir Starmer hasn't really put forward a view. He has said that he thinks 16 is too young to make the decision of what gender you are. But what do you think actually he would do? Would he also keep the Section 35 on this? I don't know how it quite works, the process, or whether or not it can just be lifted and then the bill does suddenly become law. What's his view going to be? Particularly as Mark Drakeford, Labour First Minister of Wales, has also said that he is looking into doing a similar bill to what they've done in Scotland. I know this is a completely hypothetical question, but what do you think a governing Labour Party would do in this situation? Based on the fact there are many Labour MPs also that oppose this bill, they're quite divided on it. I think most MPs, would support gender reform, but there are people like Rosie Duffield that don't. Rosie Duffield, for the listeners that don't know, is the Canterbury Labour MP who is quite outspoken on her views about this issue. So what do you both think on that? I know that's quite a difficult question because it's not it's hypothetical, but what do you think?
Keir Starmer's only going to do what he thinks is the most electorally good thing, to put it in simple terms. I think it'll somehow quietly die, the Section 35 order. I don't think he will introduce legislation himself in England. I think he'll probably take the standpoint. I think if Mark Drakeford goes ahead and introduces similar legislation, he's not going to actively intervene. He's going to stand up and say, this is a devolved matter. And certainly in the case of Scotland, he's not going to be sat in court against Nicola Sturgeon. He does not have any appetite for that. He will play it like a politician.
Do you agree with that, Ben?
No, I don't, actually. I think Keir Starmer will do what he thinks will get him elected up to the point he gets elected.
Yeah,
but once you're in power, it's a different question. And I'm a historian by interest. If you take the long view of Labour governments, really every one of them since the war has moved to the left on social issues at the cost of public support. The post-war government moved towards it on things like child welfare against the support of the public. The Wilson government on things like homosexual law reform, abortion law reform, when it was very unclear that the public would support that. And the Blair government on gay rights, when it was very unclear that the public would support that. And I have no doubt that a Labour government would move towards, if not legislating for itself, things like this, certainly not striking it down in areas like Scotland and Wales. And on your point about the Labour Party being divided, you mentioned Mark Drakeford and Rosie Duffield. Mark Drakeford, sadly, I'm quite a big fan of Mark Drakeford myself, but he is not rated highly at all among Westminster Labour, sadly, in my view. And Rosie Duffield came one step away from being kicked out of the Labour Party entirely, which I don't think we should do either. But both of those figures are quite fringe figures, so it's not like we're talking about Rachel Reeves or David Lammy sort of taking a clear-cut controversial view on this.
I'll argue, I suppose it's the other way around. Lisa Nandy has said on the airwaves that she thinks that there should be more opportunity for gender change from younger years, which goes against what Keir Starmer was saying about 16 being too young. She was talking about 13-year-olds.
Well, he doesn't like her either.
Well, yes, I suppose it's trying to balance everybody, isn't it? But that's British politics or politics in general. Right, we're going to take our first break. Just before we do, I'd like to remind our listeners that you can message in on the URN website and we can read out your comments. So please feel free to do that. As we're talking about Scotland, and I do apologise about this trope, but we're going to play this song.
This is Greg James, and you're listening to University Radio Nottingham, otherwise known as URN, or EARN if you get it wrong. Go well!
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture. We are live on University Radio Nottingham, as Greg James just said there. Our second topic then is the bonfire of EU legislation. So when Rishi Sunak was running for leader, I think the first time, he said that he would scrap the remainder of EU laws within 100 days of taking office. Well, it doesn't look like that's quite going to happen, although the bill is still around and is going to happen soon if it gets passed, so that is. So this was put forward by Liz Truss as well, and Jacob Rees-Mogg under Liz Truss. Basically, when we were leaving the European Union, we obviously, under our very long time being in there, almost 50 years, we did have a lot of laws that have come from the EU that we hadn't had in our own statute book. So a lot of them were transferred over, and this bill was sort of just a series of laws were just transferred over in the process, and they're still sitting there. And basically, I think I'm right in saying that they will sort of last until the end of the calendar year. That's 2023. Unless any of them are got rid of. And that is the idea of what Rishi Sunak wants to do. So many of these laws contain laws about workers' rights and about environment regulations, and there's lots of concerns over that. Ben has been talking to me and Ted about this before and during the break of the show, and how he thinks it's going to have quite serious consequences for the government. So, Ben, over to you.
Thank you. So, I think we've adopted something like 2,400 individual pieces of legislation from our time in the EU, and I've heard a stat that it's something like the individual regulations, its number's more like 40,000, although I could be wrong there. And those regulations are vital. They make up a huge part of our employment law, things like paid annual leave, the maximum weekly working time. All of those things come through the EU. Similar for environmental law, things like parental leave, things concerning the family. All these things which we've taken for granted as part of the law are in the EU, are come through the EU, and are all set to end at the end of the year unless the government specifically points them out and codifies them in UK law. The government is saying that they can go through every single piece of legislation, every single individual regulation, and pick out which ones they like and which ones they want to scrap within, 11 months, whilst also saying they want to shrink the size of the civil service and cut the costs spent there. They haven't even started. So the idea they're going to be able to do this properly is ludicrous. Put aside the fact it's a total breach of the right of Parliament to decide what laws it wants to make, which I thought was the whole reason for making Brexit in the first place. So the bill really is quite disastrous in itself, and it's united the Confederation of British Industry and the Trade Union Congress against it, which is quite the achievement. I think the reason why the government won't drop it, even though it's obviously the sensible thing to do, is because they are frankly live in fear of the right wing of their membership and of a large chunk of their parliamentary party. And you have Boris Johnson waiting to use any excuse he can to put himself back in Downing Street. This could be a perfect opportunity for that. You have a great number of MPs and almost certainly over 50% of the membership opposed to Rishi Sunak, the campaign for conservative democracy. So they are already looking for an excuse to get him out. You have the European Research Group, which basically is of the view that Rishi Sunak and the other MPs orchestrated a palace coup to get rid of Liz Truss, who was put in by the members. And then you have Nigel Farage and GB News, who the influence of whom we're not quite sure of, but certainly seem to be growing in popularity. And I believe Nigel Farage will certainly use this as an excuse to bring himself back in to UK politics at the head of a reform coalition, and potentially there will be enough Tory MPs willing to oppose the government on this bill to really bring it down. I think this bill is the silent problem which I think will bring down the government within the next year. It's that significant.
So I'll ask some questions about that in a minute after we hear what Ted says. So Ted, first, what do you think to this?
I have similar feelings to Ben, actually, which is probably a first. I think this is a very poor piece of legislation. It's just not good government. I am all for deregulation, lowering taxes. That's my kind of politics. But you don't do it in this way. We adopted all the EU laws onto our own statute book with known as the Henry VIII laws. And now we're going to give ourselves 11 months to repeal them all. You know, there are things in there which we really do need. Some basic employment laws which come from the EU. Why are we just deciding, no, it's from the EU, therefore it must be terrible, and getting rid of them? And so, well, 11 months, we'll sort of pick and choose what we do and we don't want, whilst simultaneously cutting the civil service. This needs to be done in a very structured manner of taking laws that are on our statute, any laws, but particularly in this case, because it's relevant, the EU laws, and sending them to Parliament going, listen, what do we think about this law? What do we think about this one? Okay, you might have to put them all into one bill or something, just so it doesn't dominate the business of the House for the next 10 years. But that's how you orchestrate government. You don't just ask Parliament for permission for you as a government to blindly go through all these laws, especially when you don't have the time to do it.
Very interesting. So both of you united, despite your political differences, that this is not a great bill. I suppose just like the CBI and the trade unions, as you mentioned, Ben. So Ben, you think this will bring down the government, which is, I would have was about to say a pretty big thing, but obviously we've seen quite a few governments being brought down recently. Do you think this is because it's not feasibly possible to get it done, and therefore that there's the risk, and that's the risk from the right, that if Rishi Sunak does extend the bill, then he gets opposition from the right because they're saying, why are you extending it? But if he obviously doesn't extend it, then we lose whatever's left that they haven't looked at that point, and that will obviously annoy, pretty much everybody to the left of him, on Brexit matters, that is. Is that your thinking, or have I put words into your mouth?
Well, my thinking is that Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt, Grant Shapps, these are all people who are on, roughly speaking, the centre or the left of the Tory party. One Nation Tories, you might say. So although Rishi Sunak was a Leaver at the time, he is certainly someone who's trying to repair the image of the Tory party with business, repair their brand as a brand of stability that you can trust. There is simply no way that they can maintain that image if they go ahead with this bill, right? I think it's not quite understood how damaging this bill is. Businesses are not going to know what the law is if we go ahead with this bill. So Rishi Sunak, I have no doubt in my mind, is looking for a way to kill off this bill. The problem is he is really at the mercy of the right wing of his party, because he only needs 40 or 50 MPs to go against him, and he'll be in chaos. He won't be able to command a majority in the Commons on this bill. So it really is a case for disaster. And I think the Brexit issue is just such a emotional issue for so many Tories and people to the right of the Tories that I can't see this ending in a way other than a fundamental split in the party.
So do you think that there will be a vote of no confidence in Rishi Sunak by the Conservatives? Is that the sort of thing you're thinking will happen?
Quite possibly, or they might bring some procedure, some vote to try and either when the vote, if they try and kill off the bill, that'll lead to a vote of no confidence, or if the bill even goes to a vote, or some attempt to reaffirm the fact that we're going to keep the EU laws until we work through them in a time-respectful manner, that'll face opposition in the Commons. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that by that point, I think Rishi Sunak will have struck a deal over Northern Ireland, over the protocol, and there will be further tax rises, in my opinion, on the budget, both of which will severely antagonise the right of the party anyway, so they'll be in no mood with him by that point anyway, if they are now.
So, okay, let's say hypothetical world, there is a vote of no confidence in Rishi Sunak. Do you think he will survive that? If you think he's going to go and the government's going to completely collapse, are we going to have an election, or are we going to have another Conservative Prime Minister, or the third option, always lurking, Boris Johnson? What do you think?
I imagine if there's a vote of no confidence, to an extent it doesn't matter if Rishi Sunak wins or loses, because that'll just... The Conservatives really are on the last chance saloon at this point. If they can't bring a Conservative government together in these next 2 years, I really think there is no chance of them left at the next election. To be elected with an 80-seat majority and to fail this spectacularly, I really think, even if he stays in government, we'll see them collapse the next election.
Okay, well, what do you think to that, Ted?
I think the right of the Conservative Party is smarter than Ben's giving them credit for. I think there may well be this strong desire to get rid of Rishi Sunak, but they realise that will just lead to, at the earliest opportunity possible, Keir Starmer being in Downing Street. How do they go about removing him? We're talking about a vote of no confidence in the government, so tabled in the House of Commons, which, if he loses, would bring down the government completely, and would mean a general election, essentially, very quickly. But if they want to do it, a vote of no confidence in his leadership internally in the Conservative Party, then they're going to have to change the rules again, because he's protected for a year.
Yes, that's a good point. That is a good point.
Well, if you don't mind me...
No, I don't mind.
Talking about whether the right of the Conservative Party is smarter than they give them credit for, their last backed candidate was Liz Truss, and in those debates between Sunak and Truss are really quite incredible things, because Rishi Sunak spells out line by line what then went on to happen. So I'm
You're giving Rishi Sunak credit.
I'm
there,
not on the right
then?
of the Conservative Party myself, but I'm not sold about their strategic intelligence. But let's say you are on the right of the party. I think there's an argument to be made, and certainly there are hints towards this in the Telegraph, that Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer aren't all that different.
Yeah.
Rishi Sunak is very much has not focused on public expenditure cuts to allow tax cuts in the same way that many wanted him to. He has not cut taxes at all, and he raised them further from when he was Chancellor, when he raised them again. So I think there's an on the right of the party that at this point, really, they might be better off going with a Nigel Farage Reform UK party, or trying to bring in Boris as frankly, a empty vessel who they can fill with his ideas, to get the current government out. It's not a question of do you have a Conservative government or a Labour government if you think the Conservative government isn't that different to a Labour government.
Yes, I agree, but I don't think the right of the Tory party will give up hope to that extent that they'll go, oh, we might as well let Labour in. I think they will say themselves, yeah, Rishi Sunak, not very different, but ultimately letting some of those MPs from the Labour Party into the government benches, I think will scare the right of the party, and they will not allow Starmer, just because they don't think he's very different personally to Rishi, to let him in. And I don't think, quite frankly, that Boris will be back yet. I personally hope he never comes back. But you really think that at the moment he's not going? You think he's going to want to come back when they're this far behind in the polls just to lose the looming election? It's been verified seemingly as much as possible by now that he had enough support to put himself on the ballot to return after Liz Truss, and he'd have won. He'd have beaten Rishi Sunak. But he's fully aware that at the moment the Tories are facing a electoral loss. You can question the man's own arrogance whether he realises it. He might think quite well that he's got a chance to turn this around. But I think he's more realistic than that, and it showed by the fact that he refused to stand in the last leadership election.
Well, but he didn't refuse to stand from the outset. Indeed, he came very close to declaring. He flew back, and the consensus, although I have no actual evidence of this, but the general consensus is in the press is that he met Rishi Sunak, and Rishi Sunak says, if you run, you will win, and I will use my MPs to sink you, is what I have heard. If Rishi Sunak then loses all of his credibility and gets defenestrated by the Tory party, he loses that credibility. So I think, you talk about whether Boris Johnson, within his own arrogance, thinks he can win. He absolutely does. And by the way, you know what? I in a moment of bipartisanship, I don't think that is entirely unique to him. I think that Tony Blair, when he was clearly unpopular on every front, clung on desperately until he was finally forced out in a more graceful manner than Boris Johnson, but forced out nonetheless. I think it's amazing what the mind can convince oneself of when you're in that proximity to power.
That's a good point. Now, both of you started to mention Starmer here. Starmer, of course, was a big supporter of Remain and then rejoined, second EU referendum, rather, I should say. He hasn't backed rejoin, I should say. So Remain, second referendum, he doesn't back rejoin. That's his calculation, presumably based on all the Labour leavers that departed his party to vote for the Conservatives. That's still a line that he's taking. Polls seem to indicate that there is a rising number of people that have what is being called regret, people that voted leave that regret that decision. What do you do if you're Keir Starmer? Because it's still quite early days. He might not want to take the risk of electorally trying out a idea of having a closer relationship with the EU in a general election quite so soon after 2019, when that was one of the reasons it's believed that they lost that. What do you think he's going to do in this situation?
I don't think he'll do anything. I think he recognises that even the regret, it's being called, I think there's very little appetite in this country to reopen the wounds of Brexit and to go through it all again. He's not going to be able to just rejoin with a sort of executive order style and just say to Brussels, can we come back in? And they say, yeah, and we get on with it. He's going to have a referendum. And I really don't think, just genuinely don't think that there is an appetite, even amongst people who would actually have decided they'd rather we stayed in, to revisit that. And whilst he's, again, pre-election, as Ben mentioned earlier, sort of what he might do mid-term as opposed to the promises he'll make pre the election, whilst he's so far ahead and he hasn't really got a policy on it, his policy is just, well, no, there's no need to do anything differently. I can't see him, unless he gets too cocky and thinks that he's got the election won, to throw in promises like that. Yeah. And it's also then such a big thing that I don't think he can bring that in mid-term, decide it's a policy. I could envisage a situation in which he spends a term in Downing Street and then puts it into his manifesto for his second term, depending on the mood of the country then.
I think there's a case for Brino, Brexit in name only, which is that we don't rejoin the EU, we don't rejoin the single market, we don't rejoin the customs union, but we maintain our regulations to the extent that we did when we did trade in them. And the EU says, well, maybe we can make you a unofficial trade partner on different areas of trade. So we are effectively in the customs union, just not in name, which I personally think is the greatest, is probably the best option for him. Because I agree with Ted, to reopen the idea of Brexit is possibly the only thing that could lose Labour the election now, although never count Labour out of its ability to lose an election at the last hurdle. I do think one thing he really does have to change the dialogue on is freedom of movement. I think really the UK has lost appetite in its quest for lower immigration, particularly when it's made clear how dependent our public services like the NHS, and I expect we'll come on to this in our next topic, how dependent they are on EU migrants and foreign labour. And I think he really should make the case for why we need those workers to come back, because our public services only function with them. So on that element of leaving the EU, I think he does really have to change the debate. But on the rest of it, I agree. It's for the birds. And if we're talking about Keir Starmer 5 years into Downing Street, that's a different question. But at the moment, he should avoid it.
Interesting points. Thank you both. And we could probably talk about that even more. But we're going to take another music break now before our final topic. And as we're talking about the bonfire of EU laws, I suppose they're all going to be going up in a firework. Hello, welcome back to The Big Picture. We are live on University Radio Nottingham. This is our third and final topic, which is on strikes. So, we've got quite a few different groups that are on strike wanting a better pay because their pay in real terms has decreased. Inflation, of course, is particularly high at the moment. So, going on strike, we have nurses, teachers, ambulance drivers, people that work in the trains, and also university staff, of course, which are not shy to strike. That's not exactly new, but they're also striking as well. So quite a lot of different groups striking. The public seem to be in favour of these groups striking, except for the trains. I think perhaps as it's been going on for a while, the public mood has turned. There's an interesting point that I'm going to mention later on to the panel. I want to know their thoughts, but I'll say it now. Interestingly, overwhelmingly, the public back nurses going on strike. But teachers, which on average are paid less than nurses, the public, although on balance do support them, it's more 50-50 going on strike, which is an interesting point that I'd like to mention. So we've got lots of people going on strike. The government is not really budging. There was a talk of a one-off payment perhaps to nurses. What do you think? And also, let's not forget, of course, that there is a bill that will require a minimal level of service, which will make it possible for people going on strike to be sacked as well. What do you think to this? Ted, what do you think to the level of strikes? And do you think this bill, this idea that you could be sacked if the minimal service hasn't been provided is a good idea?
I think the bill is a very good idea. I think that this is crippling the country, and we need to do something to get over it. And quite frankly, I just think the demands of some of the unions are completely undoable. You know, talking about nurses wanting 5% pay rise above inflation, 15% pay rise. It's just a non-starter.
Wasn't it?
Sorry?
It was 19%.
19%, okay, even better. 19% pay rise, that's just a non-starter, and a complete failure to acknowledge from the trade unions that these are inflationary demands they're making. That it's just going to want to give pay rises to every area of the public sector. We end up with more inflation, which will lead to them striking again, demanding even more pay rises above inflation. And there's got to be a point at which people realise, okay, we can't demand this for ourselves because it's just fueling the inflation.
Do you agree with that, Ben?
No, not at all. I'm not a very militant person, but the idea that it's unaffordable to ask for a 19%, that you're going to tell people they can't demand a 19% pay rise for the nurses, when you actually could give the nurses a 40% pay rise with the 30 billion that was wasted, flushed down the toilet by the mini budget. And the idea that you as a government are going to say, oh, don't be silly, we can't afford that, right? Having just wasted that money, going against every economic expert, every piece of guidance they were given, is ridiculous. And it's an outrage, frankly, this idea that they can't worry their silly little heads about what can be afforded, right? You can't tell people you can't go on strike, we can't afford it, when you have just been behind the biggest government financial disaster in modern history. It is an outrage that public servants and teachers in particular, I think, are treated by contempt because at least the nurses are sort of seen as being part of the NHS, the national religion. But it's an outrage that the government is treating workers this way. And you can't expect the government to have any authority whatsoever when it talks about what is affordable and what isn't. And I'm not talking about legal authority. Any government that can command a majority in Parliament has a legal authority, but the government has no moral or practical authority when it tells people that they can't afford certain things when you have acted as this government has. So I frankly support every single strike that is in the making, because people have a right to demonstrate their anger. People have a right to demonstrate that this government has completely abandoned its original message, and the only way it's going to be solved is if the government accepts it has lost its authority, it has lost its original mandate, and calls an election.
Ted, how do you respond to that?
Well, it was a different government, for one thing. It might be the same party in government, but you can't hold Rishi Sunak responsible for that. I think it'd be quite right for you to be saying this if Liz Truss was still in office, but that's the point. She left because she'd lost that credibility. And yes, you're quite right that the public will always support the nurses because of the cult of the NHS. Interesting that the thing that people seem to be using regularly, the trains, and they're not working. They're not supporting the strikes there.
People don't regularly use the NHS.
No, most people.
They support the nurses because they have no contact with the NHS, but because they use the trains more often.
Most people do.
People, vast swathes of the public use the NHS every time. It's the idea that whenever you are sick, which is not an infrequent thing when our food market is so pumped full of unhealthy food and when the air is so unhealthy, it's actually you're just not living in the real world, Ted.
No, most people do not use the NHS.
People come into contact with the medical professional many times in their lives.
Many times in their lives, but not to the extent which a lot of people who are relying on the trains every day do.
No, it's a total abdication of responsibility by the government. The government doesn't have any authority over the public, I'm afraid, and it can't claim to. And the fact that, and by the way, on the point about their minimum service requirements, the point that they use is that, many European countries have this, which is true as a last resort, and it's also true that those European countries have a much, much greater role for the trade unions in the pay decision process. And the idea that the government is just accepting the independent pay review body, they have denied and not accepted those recommendations many times in the past. They're choosing this particular one because now they really are saying there is no money because they've just wasted a load of it.
So how do you think then, Ben, Labour are going to be able to afford these pay rises if they were in power? Because they've said that they would, and you're right, of course, to say that the government has lost that money through Liz Truss's administration. But Labour have announced a series of about 44 billion. That's only $1 billion less than the unfunded tax cuts Liz Truss said of spending that they haven't said how they're going to fund it. How are they going to fund this? Where's that money going to come from? They've only announced two real ways of getting money, which is the non-dom and the status, abolishing that and getting rid of the charitable status on private schools. But that does not get anywhere near the amount of money they would require to pay off all of these pay rises.
The windfall tax, on the continuation of the windfall tax without the massive loopholes carved out by the government on big oil companies. And there's always money to be found if you're really looking to redistribute wealth in society. Indeed, I'm a socialist. I think fundamentally it's not about economic growth, it's about where the growth goes. So there's always money to be found from the vast corporations that don't pay any proper tax in the UK. They can certainly fund those promises if they want to, but actually I don't think fundamentally this is a problem of pay. This is a problem with public servants being treated with contempt by the government. I mean, I read an article in the Telegraph where it's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson called his boss, talking about how teachers were lazy, how they didn't do any proper work, how they had a holiday over COVID. I mean, teachers work more unpaid overtime than any other career out there. They work extremely hard every day. They get mountains of abuse from the public, and they get paid, as you said, on average less than your average nurse. So this is not a problem fundamentally, I think, of pay. This is a problem with the fact that they are being treated by contempt by this government. Until there's an election and a re-establishing of public trust in a government, there is not going to be peace in Britain, nor should there be.
Why do you think it is, Ben, that there's an overwhelming support for the strikes of nurses, but there isn't that same level of support? Although, again, as I said, there is, on balance, more support for strikes than not for teachers. But why do you think the level of support is nowhere near the same level as strikes for nurses?
Because there is a view among the general public that the NHS is of fundamental importance, which, by the way, I think it is. I think the NHS is a phenomenal institution. I just don't, but the public do not see national education in the same way, which in my opinion is a great tragedy. I'm biased here. My mum works in a comp. She works harder than anyone I know. They get, and they're treated horribly by many parents. Maybe it is because they have more direct contact and they think that they're not doing a service to their kids, but frankly they go beyond the pale. But fundamentally it's because there is a view that the NHS is sacred, which I think it is, but there is also a view that education is not, which I disagree with. So that's why.
It's an interesting point. So a friend of mine who's on the left, he doesn't support strikes on the most part. Not that's not a blanket statement, but for a lot of the cases he doesn't support strikes because in his view, some people that strike for a bigger pay when they actually are on already above average wage, and therefore by default the most of the people that they are affecting by not working are people that are less well off than themselves. What do you say to that? Because most children who will miss teachers coming in, and most people that will not get the treatment in the NHS will be paid less than the people striking because of their pay. What do you make to that, Ben?
Because you tell a teacher earning £30,000 a year with 2 kids that, well, he's earning above average pay, so he should be grateful. The argument that they are earning different to the average wage and therefore should shut up and be happy about it is ridiculous. And again, fundamentally, I don't think this is a question of pay. It's a problem of respect. And it's actually a big problem of lack of workforce because we booted out so many of our workers from other countries as a result of our leaving the EU. But no, I totally disagree with the idea that just because you earn more than the national wage, you shouldn't be able to go on strike if your pay is being harmed. And by the way, teacher pay has fallen 25% real terms. And I'll just finish with this. if you can't live a decent, lower middle class life as a teacher or as a nurse, if you don't have a dream of having your own house one day, I don't know how that's a society that can sustain itself, really.
Well, this is a question, it's probably a big question to ask and perhaps can't really be answered in the space of 3 minutes we've got left, but how is this going to be resolved, or is it going to be resolved? Or is this going to be the case that we've got another winter of discontent, although a years-long discontent, and a new administration, in this case Keir Starmer, is going to be a Thatcher figure and completely transform things, although I'm sure, Ben, you would be hoping it would be the other way round to how Thatcher transformed things. Very, very briefly, how do you see this ending, if at all?
It's people will think. It depends very much on how soon the next election is. But if it's very soon, people start to think, oh well, the Labour Party coming in now, Keir Starmer will sort it all out, and then it'll be like the 70s, and we'll realise that he's just even more in the back pocket of the trade unions, but they'll still be on strike. They won't be happy until they get paid. It doesn't matter who's in power because the money is not there.
I don't think Unite's been told that they have Keir Starmer in their pocket and they've cut their spending by their spending on the Labour Party on a vast amount since he became leader. I think fundamentally this is a broader question that a teacher and a nurse are just as valued in society as a banker or an accountant. And I'm sorry to sound all doctrinaire left-wing about this, but fundamentally it is a question of value and societal value. And until we get a government and a culture that accords public servants with the respect they deserve, discontent will continue, because you're quite right, we're in difficult economic times. So it's about values.
I don't think the problem will be solved by a certain level of respect being shown. I think it's more likely, not that I'm saying it's a good thing, but I think it's more likely that there'll be a collapse of the public sector.
Well, there we are. Fun times ahead. Thank you very much for listening to our first Big Picture back after the Christmas break, and thank you very much to Ben and Ted for taking the time to be on the show today. We'll be back again next week for some more exciting topics, but I suppose as the country is sort of grinding to a halt, we are in a bit of an SOS.